The fastest way to misjudge a man is to assume his bank balance looks like his clothes. Daniel Brooks pushed open the glass door of Whitmore Financial with one hand while holding the door for his 8-year-old daughter with the other. The downtown branch was everything people expected from a private financial institution. Polished marble floors reflected the morning sunlight. Quiet conversations drifted through the lobby. Men and women in expensive suits moved between offices carrying tablets and folders. Daniel looked out of place the moment he stepped inside. His work boots showed signs of years of use. His denim jacket had faded from countless washes. There was nothing about him that suggested wealth, influence, or importance. Beside him, Emma walked quietly with a small backpack hanging from one shoulder and a worn stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm. She looked around the lobby with curiosity while Daniel approached the reception desk. "Good morning," he said politely. "I would like to make a withdrawal." The receptionist smiled professionally. "Of course, sir. How much would you like to withdraw?" $50. The woman nodded and began typing. It should have been a routine request. The kind that happened hundreds of times every day. Daniel stepped aside and waited. Emma sat in a nearby chair and opened a library book. Neither seemed in a hurry. Across the lobby, a group of executives emerged from a conference room. At the center of them was Charlotte Whitmore. At 32, she had become one of the youngest CEOs in the firm's history. Investors admired her discipline. Employees respected her standards. She moved through the building with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of dollars. As she passed the reception area, she happened to overhear part of the conversation. "Just $50, one employee said quietly, glancing toward Daniel. The comment drew a few smiles. Charlotte looked in his direction. Her eyes moved from the worn jacket to the work boots. Then to Emma sitting with her rabbit. "Well," she said lightly, "at least he is not asking for more than the account can handle." A few people laughed. The laughter was not loud. Not cruel. Just enough to be noticed. Emma looked up from her book. Daniel heard it too. He simply remained standing with his hands folded in front of him. No reaction. No embarrassment. No anger. Charlotte barely gave the moment another thought. She continued walking with her executives toward the elevators. Behind the reception desk, the employee processing Daniel's request entered additional information and waited for the system to respond. A few seconds passed. Then her expression changed slightly. She frowned and looked at the screen again. Whatever appeared there was unexpected. She entered the information a second time. The same result appeared. Her fingers paused above the keyboard. Nearby, another employee noticed her hesitation. "Everything okay?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she leaned closer to the monitor. Daniel remained calm. Emma turned another page in her book. Around them, the lobby continued moving through its normal rhythm. Yet something had changed. The employee slowly picked up the phone beside her desk. And for the first time that morning, a simple request for $50 no longer seemed simple at all. The receptionist lowered her voice as she spoke into the phone. "Could you come to the front desk for a moment?" She listened briefly, glanced at the monitor again, and then quietly repeated, "Yes, I am sure." Daniel remained standing near the counter. His posture never changed. Emma sat a few feet away with her book resting on her lap. Every few minutes she would turn a page, then glance toward her father before returning to her reading. Around them, customers continued arriving and leaving. Most paid no attention to the situation unfolding at the front desk. A minute later a branch supervisor emerged from a nearby office. He approached with the confident expression of someone expecting to solve a routine problem in less than 30 seconds. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. The receptionist turned the monitor slightly toward him. The supervisor looked at the screen. His expression immediately changed. Not dramatically. Just enough to be noticeable. He leaned closer. Read something again. Then looked toward Daniel. Good morning, sir, he said politely. Daniel nodded. Morning. You are making a withdrawal today? Yes. $50? That is correct. The supervisor glanced back at the screen. The strange expression remained. Would you mind waiting just a few moments? Daniel shrugged lightly. That is fine. The supervisor thanked him and stepped away from the counter carrying a tablet. The receptionist watched him disappear into a secured hallway. Emma closed her book for a moment. Dad? She asked. Yes? Did something break again? Daniel smiled faintly. I do not think so. It looks like something broke. Daniel glanced toward the hallway where the supervisor had vanished. Maybe they are just being careful. Emma accepted the answer and returned to her book. Across the lobby, Charlotte had just finished a meeting near the executive offices when she noticed the same supervisor walking quickly toward the administrative section of the building. His pace seemed unusual. Curious, she stepped aside and stopped one of the managers passing by. What is happening at the front desk? She asked. The manager looked toward the lobby. I am not sure. Charlotte followed his gaze. Daniel was still standing quietly beside the counter. Emma was still reading. Nothing about either of them suggested urgency. Yet employees were clearly reacting as though something important had appeared on their screens. The gentleman requesting the withdrawal? Charlotte asked. I think so. She frowned slightly. For $50? The manager gave a small shrug. Apparently. A few minutes later another employee appeared behind the reception desk. Then another. Neither interacted with Daniel directly. Both looked at the monitor. Both exchanged confused glances. Charlotte noticed that as well. The situation had become difficult to ignore. Back at the counter, the receptionist received a new message through her headset. Her eyes widened slightly. Understood, she replied. She ended the call and sat silently for several seconds before looking toward Daniel again. This time her expression contained none of the casual amusement that had been present earlier. If anything, she looked nervous. Daniel noticed the change but said nothing. Emma looked up from her book once more. Dad? She asked. Yes? You always tell me people act strange when they do not understand something. Daniel smiled. That sounds like something I would say. Emma nodded toward the employees gathered around the desk. Then I think they are confused. Daniel followed her gaze. Several people were now studying the same account information. None seemed eager to explain what they were seeing. And somewhere deeper inside the building, someone much higher in the organization had just been notified. Nearly 20 minutes had passed since Daniel first approached the counter. Under normal circumstances, the transaction would have taken less than 2. Yet no one seemed willing to complete it. The lobby maintained its polished appearance, but beneath the surface a quiet tension was spreading from one employee to another. Daniel sat beside Emma now, both waiting patiently. Emma had finished one chapter of her book and was beginning another. Every so often she would glance toward the reception desk where employees continued exchanging nervous looks. None of it appeared to bother her. Daniel seemed equally unconcerned. A senior operations manager emerged from a secured elevator near the back of the building. Unlike the others, he did not stop at the front desk immediately. Instead, he entered a restricted office overlooking the lobby through a glass wall. Within moments, 2 supervisors joined him. The blinds remained open. Anyone paying attention could see the group studying documents and computer screens with unusual intensity. Charlotte noticed. She had been preparing to leave for another meeting when she saw the gathering inside the office. Curiosity pulled her back toward the lobby. The situation no longer made sense. A simple withdrawal request had somehow involved multiple layers of management. She approached one of the branch directors. "What exactly are they looking at?" she asked. The director hesitated. "An account." Charlotte folded her arms. "I figured that part out." The director offered an uncomfortable smile. "It is complicated." "How complicated can $50 be?" The director looked toward Daniel before lowering his voice. "Apparently more complicated than anyone expected." Charlotte disliked vague answers. Numbers were supposed to make sense. Systems were supposed to make sense. Financial institutions existed because order replaced uncertainty. Yet uncertainty was exactly what she was seeing. Back at the seating area, Emma closed her book and looked up at her father. "Can I ask a question?" she said. "You usually do," Daniel replied. Emma smiled. "Why do we keep money in this account anyway?" Daniel leaned back slightly. "Because it is useful." "You never use it." "Not often." Emma considered that answer. "I like the other account better." Daniel laughed quietly. Most people would. The comment sounded innocent. It sounded like the sort of conversation any father and daughter might have. Yet a nearby employee happened to overhear it. His expression changed instantly. He looked toward Daniel. Then toward the front desk. Then toward the office where managers were gathered around the account information. A few moments later he hurried away. Charlotte caught the movement. Another clue. Another reaction. Another piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Then something happened that changed the atmosphere entirely. The operations manager stepped out of the glass office carrying a folder. He crossed the lobby without speaking to anyone and approached Daniel directly. His posture was noticeably respectful. "Mr. Brooks," he said. "There are a few details we need to verify." Daniel nodded. "Of course." The manager glanced at the folder before looking back at him. "It has been a very long time since anyone accessed this account." For the first time, several employees nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Emma looked up from her chair. "See," she said softly. "I told you we never use it." The manager stared at her for a second. Then back at Daniel. And somehow that simple statement seemed to make him even more nervous than before. The operations manager remained standing beside Daniel for several moments, holding the folder as though it contained something unusually fragile. Around the lobby, employees continued working, but the rhythm had changed. Conversations became quieter. Glances became longer. Even customers waiting nearby seemed aware that something unusual was happening. Daniel noticed none of it, or at least acted as though he did not. He simply sat beside Emma and waited. The manager cleared his throat. "There are a few authorization requirements attached to this account." Daniel nodded. "I remember." The manager looked mildly surprised. "You do?" "They were there the last time I used it." The answer only deepened the confusion. Emma looked up from her chair. "How long ago was that?" Daniel thought for a moment. "A while." "A year?" "Longer." "5 years?" Daniel smiled. "Longer." Emma's eyes widened. "Wow." Nearby, one of the supervisors exchanged a glance with another employee. The account was becoming more mysterious by the minute. Across the lobby, Charlotte continued watching from near the executive offices. She had postponed her next meeting. That alone was unusual. Her schedule rarely allowed distractions. Yet something about the situation refused to let go of her attention. The manager carrying the folder was one of the most experienced people in the building. She had seen him handle multimillion-dollar transactions without visible concern. Now he looked uncertain discussing a $50 withdrawal. None of it made sense. A few minutes later another elevator opened. This time a senior executive from the corporate compliance division stepped into the lobby. Several employees straightened immediately when they saw him. He normally worked 3 floors above the executive suite and almost never visited the retail banking area. Yet here he was, walking directly toward the front desk. Charlotte frowned. That was not normal. The compliance executive reviewed information on a tablet while speaking quietly with the operations manager. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. Then both men looked toward Daniel. Neither approached him. Neither interrupted him. They simply seemed to be confirming something. Emma noticed the attention. "Dad?" she asked softly. "Yes? Do all banks do this?" Daniel looked around. "The lobby. Not usually." "Then why is this one doing it?" Daniel considered the question. "Maybe they have not seen this account in a long time." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "That seems to happen a lot." The comment sounded innocent enough. Yet the compliance executive happened to overhear it while passing nearby. He stopped walking. "A lot?" he asked politely. Emma looked at him. "People get confused when they see this account." The executive stared at her for a second before turning toward Daniel. Daniel simply shrugged. "She is not wrong." For the first time, the executive actually smiled. Then he looked back at the tablet. The smile disappeared almost immediately. Whatever information he was reading carried far more weight than anyone in the lobby understood. Moments later his phone rang. He answered. Listened. Then stood completely still. "Yes," he said quietly. "I understand." When the call ended, he looked toward the executive offices upstairs. His expression had changed entirely. Somewhere beyond the lobby, someone at the highest level of the organization had just become involved. The atmosphere inside Whitmore Financial had become almost surreal. What had started as a routine morning now felt like an investigation that nobody could explain. Employees moved carefully. Conversations stopped whenever someone new entered the lobby. Even customers waiting for appointments seemed aware that something unusual was unfolding. Daniel sat quietly beside Emma, showing no signs of impatience despite the delay. His hands rested calmly on his knees. Emma had finished her book and was now drawing small sketches on a notepad she carried in her backpack. Neither appeared concerned. Across the lobby, Charlotte stood near the executive offices watching the situation evolve. She had built her career on understanding risk. She understood markets, acquisitions, and complex financial structures. Yet she could not understand why a withdrawal request for $50 had triggered responses from departments that normally dealt with multimillion-dollar decisions. The compliance executive remained near the reception area, speaking quietly with managers. A few moments later, another call arrived. This time everyone nearby noticed the change in his expression. He listened carefully, asked no questions, and ended the call. Then he looked directly at Daniel before turning toward the managers. "Conference room 3, he said. "Now." Within minutes several senior employees disappeared into a secured meeting room. Glass walls lined one side of the space. The blinds were quickly lowered. Charlotte watched the room fill with people who rarely appeared together outside major corporate reviews. Operations. Compliance. Legal. Executive administration. Something far larger than a customer transaction was clearly being discussed. One of Charlotte's senior advisors approached her. "You should probably come upstairs," he said. "Why?" "There is an issue involving a pending institutional transaction." Charlotte frowned. "What kind of issue?" "The acquisition package scheduled for next quarter." Her expression tightened. That acquisition represented one of the largest strategic projects in the company's future plans. "What does that have to do with the lobby?" she asked. The advisor hesitated. "That is exactly what everyone is trying to figure out." Meanwhile, Daniel remained seated. Emma looked up from her drawings. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Are we going to miss lunch?" Daniel checked the time. "Hopefully not. Because I was thinking about pancakes." Daniel smiled. "Pancakes for lunch?" Emma nodded confidently. "Good pancakes can be eaten anytime." A nearby employee overheard the exchange and could not help smiling. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Entire departments inside the bank appeared stressed and confused while the man at the center of the situation was discussing pancakes with his daughter. Then another development occurred. The doors to conference room 3 opened. Several senior managers exited carrying documents. Their faces looked more concerned than before. One of them approached the compliance executive and handed him a folder. He opened it, read a page, then slowly looked across the lobby toward Daniel. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. The manager nodded. "Every record confirms it." The compliance executive closed the folder. For several seconds he simply stood there. Charlotte noticed. Everyone noticed. Whatever had just been discovered was not creating clarity. It was creating more confusion. And somewhere inside the highest levels of Whitmore Financial, people were beginning to realize that the quiet single father waiting patiently beside his daughter was connected to something none of them had expected. The waiting continued, but the uncertainty inside Whitmore Financial was reaching a breaking point. Conference Room 3 had become the center of activity. Managers entered carrying reports and left carrying new questions. Compliance officers moved between departments. Legal advisors were now involved. What should have been the simplest transaction of the day had somehow attracted the attention of people who normally spent their time reviewing institutional agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet no one seemed able to explain why. Daniel sat quietly beside Emma as if none of it concerned him. Emma had finished her drawings and was now watching people move through the lobby. "Dad," she said. "Everybody looks worried." Daniel followed her gaze toward the conference room. "A little. Should we tell them not to worry?" Daniel smiled faintly. "That probably would not help." Emma considered that. "Maybe." Across the lobby, Charlotte had finally entered the executive conference room herself. The moment she walked in, the conversation stopped. Documents covered the table. Screens displayed account histories and internal records. Several senior managers looked exhausted. Charlotte took a seat. "Someone explain this to me." The compliance executive slid a file across the table. "We are trying." Charlotte opened it. Most of the information appeared ordinary at first. Then she reached several sections that were unlike anything she had seen before. Layers of authorization protocols. Historical protections. Executive restrictions. Internal notes dating back years. Some sections required clearance levels that exceeded ordinary executive access. Charlotte looked up. Who approved these controls? No one answered immediately. Finally, one manager spoke. "That is part of the problem." "What does that mean?" The manager exchanged a glance with legal counsel. "Many of the protections predate current leadership." Charlotte frowned. "How far back?" "Several administrations." Silence settled across the room. Whitmore Financial had existed for decades. Leadership changed. Boards changed. Strategies changed. Yet certain structures apparently remained untouched. The account connected to Daniel Brooks seemed to be one of them. Back in the lobby, another employee approached Daniel carrying a bottle of water and a snack pack for Emma. "Thank you," Emma said politely. The employee smiled. You are welcome. Then he looked toward Daniel. We are sorry for the delay. Daniel nodded. It is not a problem. The employee hesitated. Most people would be frustrated by now. Daniel glanced at Emma. We have had longer waits. Emma nodded enthusiastically. The DMV was way worse. The employee laughed despite himself. Moments later his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. The smile disappeared. Excuse me. He hurried away. Everywhere inside the building, the same pattern continued. Questions produced more questions. Answers created larger mysteries. Then, just after noon, the conference room door opened again. A senior legal advisor entered carrying a thick archival binder retrieved from company records. Several people stood as she approached the table. She placed the binder down carefully. We found additional documentation. Charlotte immediately opened it. The first pages contained historical agreements. The next contained executive memorandums. Then she reached a section that caused her to stop turning pages altogether. Her eyes narrowed. This cannot be right. The legal advisor nodded slowly. That was our reaction too. Around the table, every executive leaned forward. Outside the conference room windows, Daniel remained seated beside his daughter, calm and patient as ever. Inside, the highest levels of Whitmore Financial were beginning to realize that everyone had been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. Charlotte stared at the archival binder for several seconds. Around the table, nobody spoke. The legal advisor slowly turned the document toward the others. A single page rested beneath a protective sleeve. It was old enough that the paper had begun to yellow around the edges. Yet the signature at the bottom remained perfectly clear. Charlotte read it once. Then again. Her eyes moved to the account holder's name displayed on the screen nearby. Then back to the signature. The room became completely silent. That is impossible, one executive whispered. No, the legal advisor replied quietly. Unfortunately for our assumptions, it is not. Charlotte closed the binder and stood up. Bring him in. Minutes later, Daniel entered conference room 3 with Emma walking beside him. He looked exactly the same as he had all morning. Worn jacket. Calm expression. No sign of urgency. No sign of importance. Emma carried her rabbit beneath one arm and looked around the room with curiosity. The executives sitting around the table seemed far more nervous than either of them. Daniel glanced at the gathering. You wanted to see me? Charlotte looked directly at him. For the first time that day, there was no trace of amusement in her expression. Mr. Brooks, she said carefully, how long have you had this account? Daniel thought for a moment. Almost 20 years. Several executives exchanged glances. Charlotte continued. And during those 20 years, you never mentioned your connection to the institution? Daniel looked mildly confused. Nobody asked. The answer landed harder than anyone expected. The legal advisor slid the archival binder toward him. Daniel glanced at the page and nodded once. I have not seen that in years. Charlotte took a slow breath. Then it is true. Daniel remained silent. The legal advisor finally spoke. 20 years ago, Whitmore Financial faced a liquidity crisis that threatened its survival. Several investors withdrew support. Multiple expansion projects collapsed. Internal records show that an independent financial structure was created to stabilize operations. He paused. That structure became the foundation for everything this institution eventually grew into. Nobody moved. And according to every document we have found, the advisor continued, that structure was created by Daniel Brooks. The room froze. Charlotte looked at Daniel. You built it? Daniel shrugged lightly. A lot of people helped. But it was yours. Another quiet pause. Yes. No celebration followed. No dramatic speech. Just a simple confirmation. Yet the effect was immediate. Every strange system restriction suddenly made sense. Every unusual authorization requirement. Every protected protocol. Every nervous reaction from compliance and legal departments. The account had never been important because of the money inside it. It was important because it belonged to the man whose financial framework had quietly supported the institution for 2 decades. Emma looked around the room and frowned slightly. Why does everybody keep looking at Dad like that? No one answered. Charlotte could not. She remembered the joke she had made that morning. The laughter. The assumptions. Daniel had heard all of it. And still he had sat patiently for hours waiting for $50. Finally Emma looked up at her father. Dad? Yes? Did they finally figure out who you are? Daniel smiled faintly. Looks like they did. The silence inside conference room 3 lingered long after the revelation. No one seemed eager to speak first. For years, executives had studied reports, growth charts, acquisition plans, and historical summaries without ever paying attention to the quiet name buried inside the oldest records. Now that name was sitting across the table from them wearing a faded denim jacket. Charlotte slowly lowered herself into her chair. The confidence that usually guided every decision felt strangely absent. Why did you never tell anyone? She asked. Daniel looked at her. Tell them what? What you built. What you created. Daniel glanced at the binder. Because it was never about me. Several executives exchanged looks. The answer sounded simple. Too simple. Yet somehow that made it harder to challenge. The legal advisor opened another section of the archival records. There is more. Everyone turned toward him. He removed a document protected beneath a transparent sleeve. The stabilization structure was only the beginning. Charlotte studied the pages as they were passed around the table. The records described a sequence of financial decisions stretching across 2 decades. Emergency guarantees. Long-term trust protections. Strategic reserve frameworks. The deeper they looked, the more they discovered that many of the institution's most successful periods could be traced back to systems Daniel had quietly helped establish years earlier. This does not make sense, one executive said. If these records are accurate, several expansion phases should never have survived. The legal advisor nodded. They almost did not. He pointed toward another page. Until additional capital support was arranged. Charlotte followed the reference. Then she stopped reading. Her eyes widened slightly. Daniel? He looked up. Yes? You personally funded this? Daniel shrugged. Some of it. The room became quiet again. One manager leaned back in disbelief. Another simply stared at the documents. What shocked them was not the money. It was the pattern. Every time the institution had faced a major threat, Daniel's name appeared somewhere in the background. Never publicly. Never prominently. Just quietly supporting the foundation while others received recognition. Emma looked around the room. Dad likes helping people. The statement was innocent. Childlike. Yet no one disagreed. Charlotte remembered the comment she had made that morning near the lobby. The laughter. The assumptions. They felt much heavier now. There is one more thing, the legal advisor said. He turned toward Charlotte. The acquisition project scheduled for next quarter. Charlotte nodded. What about it? The reserve structure supporting that transaction still operates through protections created by Daniel. Several executives looked up immediately. You mean the acquisition depends on his framework? Not indirectly, the advisor replied. Directly. The significance settled over the room. One of the largest projects in the company's future rested upon systems created by the very man who had been standing at the reception desk waiting for $50. Charlotte slowly looked toward Daniel. For the first time all day, she understood why compliance, legal, and operations had reacted the way they had. The account was not important because of its balance. It was important because it represented a living connection to the foundation beneath the entire institution. Emma broke the silence once more. So does that mean we can get pancakes now? A few nervous laughs escaped around the table. Daniel smiled. Hopefully soon. Yet as the executives looked at him, many realized the story was still larger than they had imagined. They had finally discovered who Daniel Brooks was. Now they were beginning to understand what he truly meant to Whitmore Financial. The tension that had filled Whitmore Financial all morning gradually faded into something else. Respect. Not the kind created by titles or authority. The quieter kind that appeared when people finally understood who they were standing in front of. The executives remained seated around the conference table, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The questions were gone. The confusion was gone. Only understanding remained. Daniel glanced at the clock on the wall. If everything is resolved, he said calmly, I would still like to complete my withdrawal. For a moment nobody spoke. Then several people laughed softly. The sound was not nervous this time. It was genuine. After everything that had happened, after the archival records, the legal reviews, the revelations, and the hours of investigation, Daniel Brooks still wanted the exact same thing he had requested that morning. $50. Nothing more. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment before standing. I think we can manage that. Minutes later the group returned to the main lobby. Employees immediately noticed the difference. The executives who normally carried themselves with authority were now walking beside Daniel rather than ahead of him. The reception staff stood as they approached. The operations manager handed over a small envelope. Mr. Brooks, he said respectfully, your withdrawal. Daniel accepted it. He opened the envelope, counted the bills once, and slipped them into his wallet. The transaction that had consumed nearly an entire day was finally complete. Emma looked up at him. Did we get it? Daniel nodded. We did. Good. She smiled. Now we can get pancakes. Several employees laughed. Charlotte found herself smiling as well. It was the first genuine smile she had worn all day. As people gradually returned to work, she stepped closer to Daniel. There is something I need to say. Daniel looked at her. Charlotte took a breath. I was wrong about you. The lobby grew quieter. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I assumed things I should not have assumed. Daniel listened without interruption. Charlotte continued. And I am sorry. The apology was simple. Honest. There was no attempt to defend herself. No excuses. Just accountability. Daniel nodded once. Thank you. That was all. No lecture. No revenge. No reminder of the laughter from earlier that morning. The simplicity of the response somehow made it more powerful. Charlotte shook her head slightly. Most people would not have handled today that way. Daniel glanced toward Emma. Most people are not trying to get their daughter to lunch. Emma immediately nodded. And pancakes are important. The comment drew another round of laughter. A few minutes later Daniel and Emma walked toward the exit. Employees stepped aside as they passed. Not because anyone told them to. Because respect had replaced curiosity. Near the door, Emma stopped and looked back toward Charlotte. You seem nicer now. Several people froze. Charlotte blinked. Then she laughed. I will take that as a compliment. Emma smiled. It is. Daniel opened the door and sunlight spilled across the marble floor. Father and daughter stepped outside together. As they disappeared into the afternoon crowd, Charlotte remained standing in the lobby watching them leave. For years she had studied balance sheets, assets, and market valuations. Yet the most valuable lesson she learned all year came from a man who had walked into her institution wearing a faded jacket and asking for $50. Beside her, one executive quietly shook his head. It is amazing. Charlotte followed his gaze toward the street outside. What is? The executive smiled faintly. That someone could build so much, mean so much, and never feel the need to tell anyone. Charlotte watched Daniel and Emma disappear around the corner. Then she nodded. That is exactly what makes him remarkable.